Hello ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to VUX World, the Practical Voice Podcast. This episode of VUX World is brought to you by BotmockBotMock. Shout out to Obaid and the BotmockBotMock team for sponsoring this episode. If you're looking for a tool that will take your idea from a little spark in your brain to a working prototype of a conversation, a voice application, then check out BotmockBotMock. The interface is super simple, it's really easy to get started, and it will take the pain out of conversation design and out of prototyping. It'll make your life a hell of a lot easier. Check out botmock.com/VUX World for a free trial. That is BotmockBotmock, BotmockBotMock.com/VUX World. Shout out to BotmockBotMock. Also, special thanks to the Conversational Academy, who also are presenting this episode, which is all about conversation design, and actually more specifically and quite fittingly, how to become a conversation designer. And if you are wanting to become a conversation designer, then today's guest has got all kinds of tips and insights into how you can go about doing that. But another way you can do that is to actually get some training, get trained up in the art of conversation design, and that is what the Conversational Academy do. They provide world-class conversation design training. It's put together by RoboCopy, who we've had on the podcast in the past, so check out that episode if you haven't already. All kinds of tips and tricks about how to design conversations, and this course essentially is the embodiment of all of their knowledge and skills and experience. I am not lying when I tell you it is the best course that I've ever tried out. It's online as well, so you can do it at your own pace. You can do it early in the morning like I do, or you can even do it kind of on your way to work or whenever you can find the time. You work at your own pace. All of the videos are online. You go through one video, you have a bit of a quiz to kind of test your knowledge, and honestly it will take you from, even if you're a conversation designer right now, doing this course will bring your knowledge up to speed. And if you're not a conversation designer right now but you want to be, this will take you through from beginning to end. By the time you've done it, you will be effectively a world-leading conversation designer. So check out conversationalacademy.com, and if you want to save 10% on the course price, then visit the link in the show notes. Now, without further ado, I won't do a big intro for this one because I've already done enough rabbiting on as it is. This episode is all about how you can go from copywriter, or essentially any role that is not conversational design, into being a conversation designer. We're talking to creative lead at Rehab, Claire Medcalf, all about how she made the transition and all about how you can do it too. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Claire Medcalf of Rehab on VUX World.
VUX World. VUX World. VUX World. VUX World. Branding with the big faces. I love listening to it.
Kane Sims.
Kane Sims, the one and only.
Britain's finest, Mr. Kane Sims.
Dustin Coates.
I like it when you guys are together and talking about voice.
Without further ado, welcome to the show.
Yeah, here we go. Dustin, this is another one in quick succession. What's this? Is this like 1, 2 now in 3 days, something mad like that?
Yeah, it's back to school is what it is, Kane.
Exactly. We had the hiatus for a couple of weeks, and now we're back on it. So we'd like to welcome Claire Medcalf to VUX World. Claire, welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Really, really glad to have you on. I come across Rehab quite a while back, and I've never actually been introduced to anybody there, but I'm obviously aware of the work that you've been doing and stuff like that, so I'm really glad that we connected and super excited to have you on a podcast. You've been doing some really interesting stuff.
Cool, thank you.
Wicked. So maybe we'll kick off with a bit of an intro. Do you want to kind of tell us, I mean, the premise of this conversation, and for those listening, I might have mentioned it in the intro, but we're going to have a bit of a conversation around how to get into conversation design. I'm sure that throughout this we'll kind of get into your path, Claire, and your kind of route that you've taken and stuff like that. But for those listening, give us a little bit of context behind yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, and maybe also a little bit about Rehab.
Sure, yeah. So I've been a creative copywriter for about, 10, 15 years now. But I didn't really know that voice and conversation design existed until maybe a couple of years ago when I joined Rehab as a freelancer. And it's been a really interesting learning curve over the last couple of years, for sure. But yeah, prior to Rehab, I spent a lot of my time at agencies, or a mix of agencies, and in-house, writing copy from everything from like public health campaigns to some big big brands trying to sell stuff. But yeah, I think I'm really enjoying this switch over to conversation design. So like I said, I started at Rehab a couple of years ago, started as a freelancer. One of the first jobs I was working on was a messenger bot on Facebook. And that was like the first bit of conversation design that I had experienced, and kind of fell in love with it pretty much straight away. We don't just do conversation design at Rehab. We're a creative tech agency, and I guess what that means is we're trying to help clients keep ahead of the curve with all things tech, and from a creative point of view, and that kind of different twist on advertising, really.
And you've also just come away from a successful spell at Cannes.
I have, yeah. It was a pretty amazing experience. So there was me and 4 others from Rehab, which we ended a team to be part of the Cannes Lion Change for Good hackathon. So we had to submit an idea for how to use tech to help Earth Day Network collect kind of data points from as many people across the globe to help with environmental issues. So whether that's water purity or air pollution. And yeah, so we'd seen this study online, which basically said you could get a reading from a photograph. You could get a reading of how polluted that area is just by analysing the photograph. So we went along to Cannes, and the hackathon, we got selected to be one of 6 teams to be part of the hackathon at Cannes. So we went along, and it was sponsored by Amazon and Huge, which are a creative agency. And we had to build as much of a working prototype in a week as possible, and part of that had to be an Alexa skill. So yeah, it was really intense, but it was one of the best weeks of my life. Like, it was amazing, and we came home with the gold. We came first, so it's amazing.
Wow, congratulations. Yeah. And that in and amongst what I've heard of the nightlife in Cannes must have been quite an accomplishment to get through the week of actual work as well.
I mean, I wish we'd seen some of the nightlife, but we were just like working away, no joke. We were working away like the whole time. I think we had a maximum of 5 hours sleep a night, and that was not out drinking. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was, we enjoyed a little bit of it.
And that's then gone on. So what's happening with that now? That's turned into an actual project then, has it?
Yeah, it has. Yeah. So we're working with the Earth Day Network to help launch a kind of a prototype of it in the coming months. And then that will go on working towards Earth Day in April next year.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Nice. Well, that's really good. Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing that. So how much of what you do at Rehab is conversation design? Because I've seen on the website, it looks as though a lot of the case studies in there are around conversation design. What's the kind of split? How much of your role, if you like, is spent doing conversation design versus other stuff?
So I think as an agency, it does make up quite a fair bit, but it's important to say that it's not the only thing that we do. I'd say it's really hard to give it a percentage, but maybe like it's 60% of the work that we do. But for my role as creative lead at Rehab, and because of the type of work I've been doing since I started here 2 years ago, most of mine is conversation design.
Claire, one thing that's interesting to me is you told us before the show, when most people think about copywriters, they think perhaps of writers who can make a living there, who studied English in school and all of that. And you said that really was not your forte in school.
No.
How do you feel like you got into copywriting despite not really being on that path before?
Sure. I forgot I told you that. I probably didn't tell people that I'm not good at English or wasn't good at English. But yeah, I don't think I was very good at English at school, and that kind of stuck with me way too long. But I did graphic design at university, graduated in 2004. But I was really lucky that graphic design course was really broad. So we covered everything from illustration to advertising to proper design work. But because it was so broad, it meant that I didn't have to specialize, and I kind of naturally found myself going into the kind of the advertising creative route. But then I graduated and had some interesting jobs straight out of university, one of which was like working in basically a photocopy shop, which I'm not sure how much business those kind of things get anymore. Right? But then I was really lucky after that to have some great work experience at a youth charity called Kick-Ass, and we used to do these kind of PR stunts that we'd come up with ideas. Young people would come up with ideas to educate their peers on kind of issues that affect them. So when that's sexual health or managing their money, things like that. And I was there, and I had an amazing mentor as my boss there, and she kind of said to me, "Oh, you should be a copywriter." And before that point, I knew I was interested in working in the advertising world, but I thought I would be more like an art director. But then kind of, I don't know, I think the advertising industry can be pretty daunting and overwhelming. And, you know, I'm quite an anxious person, so I didn't have like that kind of bolshiness to kind of go straight into that. So I was like skirting around the edges of it for a long time. So that was the first kind of thing that made me think, oh yeah, I do think in words and come up with my ideas around words. So maybe there is something in that. And then after working at that charity, I worked for a social innovation startup called School of Everything. And I started there doing like kind of bits and bobs, like a bit of data entry kind of as I started. And then Paul, who was the CEO of School of Everything, he was like, "We really want you to join us full time. What do you want to do?" And I was like, "Well, I think I want to be a copywriter." And he was like, "Great, you can be our copywriter." So I went straight in and learned on the job, like working for an amazing company. So yeah, that was the shift, I guess.
And what have you found to be the difference after coming from getting into copywriting, spending time being a copywriter, and then you mentioned that kind of the whole kind of voice conversation thing was interesting you, and then you've obviously moved into doing conversation design in kind of a large proportion of your role. So what did you find some of the kind of main differences were from a copywriting brief to a conversation design brief?
Yeah, so there are some differences. I guess like there's a lot of similarities as well. I think the main thing being that when you're writing copy for a press ad or anything else, really, you're never getting a response. It's you're taught to make your writing sound like a conversation. It's supposed to really speak to the viewer, like you understand their needs and you kind of play to those, and you want them to feel like they're talking with you as a brand. The amazing difference with conversation design is that you actually are getting a response. So for the first time, copywriting is a conversation, and you're getting to craft that along with understanding the user. So yeah, I think that's the bit that I really, really, really love about it.
And presumably that then kind of brings you into rather than if a copywriter is spending time researching and putting words to a page, and you want it to sound conversational when it's read, but presumably in conversation design, if you are getting a response, there needs to be somebody else there or some other people there to generate that response. So is it, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is it a difference in terms of the people who you work with, or is it more collaborative in that respect?
Yeah, I guess you always have collaboration to a certain extent, but traditionally my career has always been collaborating with an art director and figuring out the best way to get visuals and words to kind of do the job that we need them to do for the user. I think the one thing that is consistent is putting the user first is really, really important. And that's something that we try to do as much as possible at Rehab. There's no point really creating anything unless you're thinking about the person that it is designed for and designed to help. And in terms of creating the work, I learned pretty early on that I can write a conversation on paper, and that's great because you just read it as one block of text and it flows beautifully. As soon as you take the user dialogue out of that and I do paper prototyping quite a lot, where I'll read the smart speaker copy to any willing human and see how they respond, and that it changes dramatically at that point because you're actually getting real answers. You're not writing the journey as you want it to happen. You're getting a real taste of what they are going to do, and then you shape the conversation around that.
When you're going to find those people to stand in as the end users, do you have to find a specific kind of person, or are you seeing that your colleagues know too much about what you're doing to really be effective?
I think it's better if they don't know as much. So picking someone at random, just put a shout out on the company Slack asking if anyone's got 10 minutes to help us out, and then obviously giving them a bit of a brief as to what the project is. But really, it's good when they don't know too much, because people using kind of voice skills or actions don't know what they do until they're using them. So that's the only path you have to educate them about the use and the benefit it has to them. So anyone.
Is there any? It sounds like what the BBC are doing as well, putting call outs to get people with different accents to come and experiment. Have you found? So you mentioned that some things are similar, some things are different. Have you found that in terms of either the tools or the techniques that you use to design a conversation versus craft some copy, have you found any differences or similarities in the tools and techniques that you use?
I think so. Things like I said, focusing on the user is really important. Trying to strike up that connection, that still needs to happen through voice. I think things so no jargon or management speak, things that can creep in on company websites and things you definitely need to strip that out, both on websites or in ads, but also in voice, because I think brevity is always important, and it's even more important when you're writing for voice or conversation design, because people just expect that point to be made clearly, simply, in a really short amount of space. Differences, I think, it made me realize, one of the things it made me realize is how much that I would use questions in kind of writing a paragraph that is just going to be read as a kind of copywriting tool. But when you can't do that, obviously, in conversation design, because you're posing the question, so that rhetorical question is going to get a response. What else?
What would an example of that be? What would an example, if you use questions a lot in copywriting, what would some examples of those kind of questions be that might catch people out on an assistant?
So have you ever thought about how your life might be easier if you had X? You can't, because you're going to get an answer. So that must change. Yeah, so it must change the way you approach it. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking every single time you're writing a line? Are you always thinking about what the response could and should be? Or are you thinking about perfecting the way that this phrase sounds? I definitely think it's falling more into the first. So definitely kind of bleeds into that UX role of understanding what you want the person to do next and what their response is. And again, UX isn't my background, but it really helps. I try and work in partnership with UX at work, but you just find yourself like switching to that way of thinking, and then the craft kind of comes later. I think, it is about that user experience first.
So do you have kind of user experience people at Rehab that you work alongside?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
so what's the difference then in a conversation design project? If a lot of what you're doing is crafting the interface, where's the line, and what's the difference then between a conversation designer and a UX person?
I mean, it's very blurry line, but you always get the best results if UX and copy are working, and tech are working together. Actually, we're really in favour of kind of working in a kind of hack sprint style at Rehab as well. So I think if you can get everyone with the skills in one room at the same time, the result is going to be better. And if it like passes on from one person to another, when working on a voice project with UX, we'll kind of sit down and think about all the areas that conversation or experience needs to cover and how they map out loosely. And then either I'll go off and write it as a conversation and then come back to speak to UX and go, okay, so this is where it's going. Does that make sense? Do we want to move it around? And sometimes it's easier if it's messenger based, because you can almost like plot it out with all the responses. I think it's really tricky when it's voice first, or voice only. It's much trickier because you are the UX line and copy line is hard to draw, because there's no point really mapping out like a decision tree in that. You have to write it as a script to know what's going to work and just make sure all the parts of that conversation plug in at the right point. Does that make sense?
And Claire, you were talking earlier about your quirks or your voice, however you want to call it. For example, using questions a lot with straight copy. Mm-hmm. When you're writing for conversation, how do you get yourself away from yourself and write instead in the voice of the assistant or the brand?
So I think that's a really good question. It's something that I'm kind of learning every day. Like I try and keep up to date with Alexa and Google Assistant's like guidelines on the best practice to write. And Kane, I know you introduced me to RoboCopy and the conversational design course and stuff. I've got a few good tips from them. I think it is practice and it's learning what works and what doesn't, and writing for the platform. So, but that's a skill kind of as a copywriter you have anyway. You kind of change the way you write to suit the medium. Yeah.
Have you done much work around like persona design and writing for different personas, or have you always been approaching it from this is Google Assistant and this is Alexa? Has it always been spoken in their voice, or have you done some sort of persona work as well?
No, definitely. So the guidelines, Alexa and Google Assistant, have very, very much been a kind of best practice in terms of getting that user through the conversation you want them to go through. In terms of tone, I've definitely done persona work before. Obviously, we work with the brands that we work with to understand them as a client and their product that they want to create, and flexing their kind of general tone of voice guidelines for this platform.
And as part of the role of a conversation designer, is it to wrap the words around what that brand narrative is, or is it to shape the persona of the thing that you're creating? Is it one-off persona design as well, or do you take the persona that's been created from somebody else and then you put it into words?
I think it's dependent on the project. I think obviously a lot of brands are now moving to exploring voice as a channel and trying to understand like who they are, what they are on this new platform. I think there'll be instances where brands will create an experience maybe around a character, kind of more kind of storytelling that would be a one kind of voice in and of itself. But I think we're seeing conversation design as more of a channel for another platform for brands to kind of reinforce who they are. Obviously, their visual guidelines are consistent across whatever channel that they're displaying this. So if a Cadbury's press ad, a Cadbury's chocolate bar in store, it's that kind of flexing it. And I think we're almost going back to that golden day of radio, and brands need to really kind of cement who they are through audio only, or audio first.
Yeah, we've spoke to quite a few people around, Joel Beckerman and Eric C and stuff on audio branding and sonic identity and all that kind of stuff, and it's that's never going away. I'm a huge fan of sound design. I think that you can accomplish a hell of a lot when it comes to shaping sound in an effective way. As a conversation designer, is that something that you're thinking about as well, in terms of, for this bit, we could write some dialogue, but we could also use this kind of earcon or sound identifier? Are you thinking in those kind of terms, in terms of, what you can use sound for and what you can use dialogue for, or are you sticking to dialogue design?
I'm starting to think more, and it's very similar to when writing radio ads, which I haven't done for a long time actually, but thinking about where sound can come in, whether that's a brand's own particular sound or just use of sound effects in general. Like, how can we paint more of a picture through their speaker? I think I'd love to do more of it. I think it's really fascinating. I've been listening to your podcast around like audio branding and stuff, and I think it's really fascinating. So yeah, let's see.
Yeah. Cool. When it comes to crafting the words on the page, crafting the conversation, is it how many revisions would you tend to go through? Because I know that, I've done kind of writing in the past, not to the level of copywriting for adverts and stuff, but a lot of freelance writing, articles and blogs and stuff like that. And I always used to kind of get to the point where it was the same when I used to make music. I would dwell on something for ages, and every single word has to be exactly right. And it's the same with crafting music. Every single sound has to be in place and it has to all kind of be perfect. And then I kind of started getting to the point, maybe when I was maybe falling out of love with the concept of writing articles day in, day out, when I stopped maybe giving it quite as much attention, and I found that I was able to do things quicker, but they maybe weren't quite as good. So in terms of the number of revisions I would go through, got shorter. But with conversation design, it almost feels as though that's kind of exploded again. Is that the case? Would you say that, how many iterations would you tend to go through when you craft a dialogue, or is it a case of just writing something and it's done?
Oh, no, it's never just write it and it's done. You know that as a writer. But I think it could be endless. Like, you could keep iterating that conversation. I look back to some of the first projects that I did, and the tech has changed a lot over the last couple of years. And I think from that point of view, I'd definitely go back and rework some of the conversations that I've written in the past. But in terms of crafting the conversations when the project's happening, I think, there's definitely writing a first pass, like the happy path as a script almost, and then the first round of paper prototyping, so the interviews I mentioned, when just getting someone to think I'm a speaker for a minute and do what I say, or hopefully do what I say, and then trying to build it out and craft the conversation at the same time. So there's crafting for the UX point of view, but also from a love of words and crafting the conversation, and that making that conversation as beautiful as it can be. Yeah, so as many as I can fit in.
Do you ever have situations where you wrote a turn of phrase or something and you were just in love with it, and the client came in and you had to end up changing it, or the interaction with the users necessitated a change?
I think, there's always going to be some bits that get changed that you love, but I think you learn not to be too precious over time. I think I can't think of any specific examples, but I've definitely had it where I've written something on the page that I think will work perfectly in the conversation, and then listening to it back when we've built it and we're testing it, it just does not make sense in the way that I thought it would. So it's more kind of feedback from the tech than from the client sometimes.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that when you write something down and you look at it, it seems all right, but then you hear it back and you change? Why do you think that is? Why do you think it sounds different?
Yeah, I think it really is just because it's relatively new. Like we don't normally write for something to speak to us unless you're writing, I was going to say, even if you're writing for kind of like a screenplay or something, it's still, what's coming next, what's going to happen. If you're only going by that last few string of words, then they need to make sense, linking back to what you just said, but also lead you on to the next part of the conversation. And I think we're so smart as humans. Like when we have a conversation with one another, there's so many cues to pick up on. There's different contexts that you just understand automatically, and smart speakers aren't that smart. So you have to kind of really hold their hand and the user's hand. Yeah.
You mentioned the tech a couple of times. How does that influence what you're writing?
I guess, I don't know if it's the tech or the user that is influencing me. I think, like I said, the user is always going to be at the heart of what we're doing. And if the tech doesn't quite understand what the user has said or is doing, then I need to write to accommodate both. But obviously the tech does influence me, and I think the changes with like having more screen support in these conversations, so with the devices having screens as well, that's changing what the conversation is from a written or spoken point of view.
What does that look like? How does the screen impact the conversation?
So in the kind of simplest example, rather than listing out all the kind of menu options, you would have like the buttons on screen, or you would have visual cues that help make sense of what they're hearing. Obviously, you don't know necessarily, so you have to make a conversation that will adapt to whether it's just speaker, or if there's screen support, or if I think one thing that we've learned over time, and we've kind of looked into quite a lot, is what we call place owners. So that's not only the device that people are using, but where they're using it and in what context, because the conversation that they're willing to have would be different. It's like in the privacy of their own home in front of their family versus on their own, or even in public but on their own. So if they're on a bus but they've got headphones in and they're typing on their phone, so both parts of that conversation are private but they're in a public place. So does that change the conversation that they're willing to have? So that's another kind of a key thing to think about. Yeah.
And that influences design decisions, does it?
Yeah, I think it does. I think we have to think about the kind of use case for users, but you never know if where that conversation is going to happen. So you have to make sure that, because I guess you would never choose just to design for one of those examples, but you might have an audience group that would most likely use it in a certain way. But I think you have to create a conversation that can adapt across all of those variables.
How does the user's comfort level or sophistication with the technology impact how you speak with them?
Well, that's a good question. I think I still kind of take it from a very handholdy point of view, but I don't think that's necessarily to do with a user's kind of experience with the tech. I think it feels more polite from the brand or for the conversation that you're designing, that you're not going to trick anyone. So I think it's not really about how comfortable they are. It's more leading them through no matter what.
And then taking a big step back and going actually to the beginning, when you do discovery with these brands that you're working with so that you know how to write and what to write, what are you asking them? What are you hoping to find out?
The conversations with the brands.
When a brand comes to you and they have engaged with you and now you need to start writing for this conversational experience, what type of information do you need to know about the brand, about their goals, about the users that will allow you to be successful?
As much of that as possible. I think we're lucky that we have an amazing strat team, and we all kind of work closely to understand both the brand goal, the client goals, the brand goals, and the user goals. We try and always, obviously we need to meet all of those, but we try and keep the user goals central, and how can we help the user in a way that is good for business as well. So ideally we would have as much kind of user research as possible based around that particular brief. We know what we're working towards, but if when we're doing user research we kind of get other ideas of what might be the solution, then that would definitely kind of change our course a little bit. But as much information as possible, like trying to understand, like when building the persona, we'll kind of work with clients to understand the tone that they want to put out there. Like, is it a mirroring of their brand tone of voice, or does it flex a little bit for this channel? But yeah, the more information about all of those, the better.
Are there specific attributes, say, about the user where you say, if I know these 4, 5, 6 things, this is going to give me a large way to understanding what I need to do?
I can't think of any specifics. Only the place owner stuff that I mentioned. So what problem are we solving? How can we do that through voice? And where can we present that information, just as a starting point? But we try and have a really detailed kind of picture of our audience, not just millennials.
Yeah. Do you do a lot of kind of like target market persona thing? Because there's 2 schools of thought, isn't there? And I don't even know which side of the fence I sit on, but some people want really, really detailed target market personas. Others kind of just, they're happy with what you described as a place owner, where they're going to use it, what they need to accomplish. Where do you kind of sit in that? Do you, as approaching conversation design, do you want a really detailed description of the target market who you're designing for, or are you just happy to say this is a family and they're in the kitchen?
I'd definitely be happy with the first one. I think I want to know that we really know the audience and we're not just kind of guessing about what's going to resonate with them. I think what we try and do is get a good mix of kind of face-to-face, like research as well as data, so we can get a clear picture. And obviously the wider that research is, the better, but then that does need to be distilled down into kind of directive brief for when it comes into copy. So I've answered a lot of questions that maybe my strat department should have answered, but yeah, I don't think there's any harm in having lots of user research.
Cool. We've kind of touched on a few, well, it sounds as though we've kind of strayed into a few different areas in terms of product and strategy and UX and all that kind of stuff. And that's probably a symbol maybe of this whole space, isn't it? In that it's so multidisciplinary and there's so much that goes into it, so much time and effort and different activities go into creating a voice experience. Do you think that, and I know this is one of the things that we spoke about kind of before the call, do you think that the role of a conversation designer is clearly defined enough, or do you think that there is clarity in terms of the perception of what conversation designers do and the roles that need to be involved in creating voice experiences?
I I think it's a really grey area. Like, I don't really know what my job title should be anymore. Like, I think I've always had copywriter in my job title for years and years and years. And most people kind of know what that is now. But even with that in itself, there's loads of different types of copywriting. There's content writing, there's, above the line, below the line. Like, copy can cover so many different things. And now it's moving into conversation design. Copy isn't in that as a title. So design is in there. And now obviously we're getting screens and as part of this experience. Does design mean like visual design again? And obviously UX design. So I think it's been a real tech-led space. I think now, as you know, from having all the conversations with the kind of sonic identity and audio branding and stuff, it's getting into a space where it's being more creative and crafted and polished. I think there's room for copy to rise up a little bit in that. I think it's hard to... It feels like it's more UX focused. Obviously, there's words in this conversation, but I'd love to see copy heroed a little bit more as part of this space.
The job that you have now, how do you see it being different a couple of years from now?
Who knows how it's going to change? I think it changes so quickly. I think that the tech does dictate that the most. But I think the creative possibilities are really going to grow. So I think it's going to be definitely seen as more of a channel or a platform for all the kind of traditional roles within advertising and creative to kind of work together to create richer experiences. So it's exciting.
Well, what kind of technical changes could you see impacting the job the most?
I think it would probably be like the natural language understanding. So if that just keeps getting better and better and better, then maybe there will be no job for copywriters in this space going forward. So yeah, that's my biggest threat.
It's interesting how it kind of, we talk often about kind of technologies converging, and that when you put a load of different technologies together, you all of a sudden have Uber, for example. And it kind of feels a little bit as though that's kind of the same when it comes to skills and talent. I mean, we've spoke about where the line is between UX and conversation design, where the line is between strategy and conversation design. And even actually, we haven't actually mentioned this, but I think maybe Dustin, you maybe have some thoughts on this in terms of where the line is between the tech or the development side and the UX as well. Because quite often that, I mean, from the stuff that we've kind of worked on, there's a direct correlation between the person who ultimately is building it and the person that's designing it, and together you end up coming up with solutions that maybe traditionally developers may have just been kind of given something and like, can you figure out how to build this? Whereas it seems, would you agree, Dustin, it seems more as though the development is also coming into UX as well?
Yeah, I would say perhaps a little bit. In my experience, it's always been a little bit like that. Maybe it goes back and forth as the tech gets stronger, as the UX becomes more of a field that's respected and trusted in the startup spaces. For a long time, devs were king, and now there's an understanding that copywriters and UX and everyone really has a say as well. But I think, Claire, you're exactly right. Certainly the NLU will have a big impact, and I'm interested to see how that impacts what you're doing, and how much time, for example, you need to spend on the error paths and misunderstanding paths. But also, does natural language generation come into play with this at all, as well? I'm actually perhaps more optimistic than you are that you'll have a job for the foreseeable future, because I don't see a computer making you chuckle or like making you think or anything like that. But could that be an aid to you as well? Perhaps.
Yeah, I think I feel like it will go like two ways. There might be some conversations that will naturally shape themselves as tech improves. But I think if that's going to happen in that direction, in the other direction, the platform's going to open up for artists, and there'll always be like this kind of creative kind of craft side that will always be explored. So I think that'll be an interesting split with how it develops.
Do you think there is the beginnings of, we've kind of mentioned, and it's kind of been a recurring theme on the podcast in terms of, design patterns and things like that, and how mobile has the hamburger menu, and, forms have got a real kind of, the UI of a form online is understood and all that kind of stuff. Do you see there being patterns and standards when it comes to conversation design, or are conversations just so unique? Is every conversation so unique that that's not possible?
I mean, I guess we're kind of working towards it being as natural and as human as possible, and I guess that will be our guide. But then I'm reading a book at the moment about how language has kind of developed on the internet, and it's not how we would write in a kind of professional official way, but it's definitely understood. So one thing that actually comes into my thinking a lot of the time is full stops. So full stops on the end of a WhatsApp message, you might think that the person is annoyed at you or is being quite blunt about something. But actually, if I'm writing for a brand, but I'm writing it in a messaging platform, do I use that full stop or not? I know it's correct to have a full stop, but I also know it can be perceived as not very nice. So yeah, I think that's interesting from that point of view. But I think there will be standards. I just don't know if they'll be governed by how people are writing naturally or how the proper way is to do it. And that's where I think the split will be.
Are there any mistakes or anything that you see in conversational interfaces with copywriting that you look at and you cringe and you go, I don't know why people are doing that?
I mean, I'm probably cringing from a point of view as, I used to do that too. But I think it's just the responses being too long, that especially when you're seeing them on screen. And I mean, it's even worse when it's being read out to you. It's just too much. Cognitive load is too much. And the conversation is just going to stop because people are lost. So yeah, I think edit is a tip for sure.
Why do you think people do that?
Because we're used to writing for bigger spaces. And I mean, obviously, a lot of us write conversations. So I'm thinking about using screen when I'm giving these examples. So in WhatsApp, I know that the way that people have or type these conversations is changing and can be quite individual, and maybe it's an age thing, I'm not sure, but like some people click send as quickly as they click return, so every sentence is a new message. But then other people will write, beautifully kind of write with proper punctuation the whole long message. So I don't know, and maybe that will vary for individual users. It will match their style. That'd be interesting.
One of the kind of real skills I've noticed from working in the past with copywriters versus people who can just throw words on a page is that kind of being concise and still saying the thing that you intend to say but with less words seems to be a really valuable skill in a copywriter. Is that still the case in conversation design? We've been talking about being brief and keeping responses short. Is the kind of how brief you need to be or how concise you need to be, is that equal to a typical copywriting project, or is it even more extreme?
I think it's more extreme, but there's also things that you need to say that you don't have to say if it was on a website with an accompanying visual. So if it's just through voice, then the hand holding, like the instructional kind of making sure you're moving people along with you. I think there's some bits that you have to say that you wouldn't have to if there was visuals with it. But yeah, saying what you need to say in a short amount of words as possible is still the number one skill for this, I think.
Cool. And then maybe lastly, let's finish off with any advice that you might have for other people who might not be a conversation designer right now, but might be wanting to do this for a living. What kind of advice would you give people who want to turn themselves from wherever they are? It could be copywriters, could be hobbyist Alexa skill builders, could be UX designers that want to be conversation designers. What kind of advice would you give those people?
I think my advice would be just to start giving it a go. Like, there are so many platforms out there where you can start building or at least prototyping the conversation. So Bot Society is an amazing one. You can really just start shaping your conversation straight away. So I'd just say give it a go. And especially if you're a writer, you've already got, 50% of the skills that you need. It's just understanding how to have that kind of two-way conversation.
Cool. Dustin, any final thoughts or any other questions for Claire?
No, this is fantastic. Thanks so much, Claire.
No worries, thank you.
Where can people reach out to you or find out more about you and more about Rehab?
So if you go to rehabagency.ai, or I'm on Twitter at Claire Medcalf, CLAIREMEDCALF.
Cool. We'll put the handle in the show notes along with the appropriate links. Claire, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Claire Medcalf, Creative Lead at Rehab. Thank you, Claire, for joining us. That was exactly what I hoped that conversation would be. We've covered conversation design and things like that in the past, and we've also done some things around moving from kind of like graphic design into copywriting or conversation design. But I think having a fresh perspective on that transition from another role into conversation design brings all of that conversation up to date for 2019, because genuinely I do get asked all the time, things around where do I learn to be a conversation designer, how can I be a conversation designer, and the general growth of this industry and the role of conversation designer is going to explode. Over the next years, we are going to need more and more conversation designers. And I know that we were sort of speaking towards the end there about where maybe the NLU gets really, really sophisticated and that kind of like debunks the need for a conversation designer. But to be honest, I think we're always going to need conversation designers, and the more and more experiences that get created, the bigger that voice gets, the more and more designers we're going to need creating and designing these conversations. So I'm really, really pleased that Claire was able to share so many insights, not just in terms of how she'd moved from copywriting into conversation design, but also some of the details around how she goes about designing conversations. I think was really, really useful. So really, really, really appreciate you joining us, Claire, and that really does bring the conversation up to date. And yeah, fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been an absolute pleasure. Until next time, see you later.